My parents told me I was adopted for 26 years, and I believed them, until my drunk aunt grabbed my arm at my cousin's wedding and laughed. "You look exactly like Uncle David." Everyone went silent. I laughed too, then stopped. 1 month later, I opened my DNA results and whispered, "So who's been lying to me?" By Friday, 3 families would never speak the same way again. The champagne went warm in my hand the second my aunt said his name. "You look just like Uncle David." Marlene laughed, wine loose and grinning, her fingers wrapped around my wrist like she was showing me off to the whole reception. "That hair. God, it's uncanny." I laughed too, for about 2 seconds. Then I watched my mother's face go the color of the tablecloth. Across the room, my father set his coffee cup down without looking at it, and it rattled against the saucer twice before it found the table. My cousin's new mother-in-law, a woman I'd met exactly once, an hour earlier, glanced at me, then at my mother, then back at her wine like she'd wandered into the wrong play and nobody had handed her a script. Someone at the next table laughed too loud, the way people do when they're trying to fill a silence that isn't theirs to fill. Marlene's smile cracked first. Her hand let go of my wrist like it had gone hot. "Oh," she said, so quiet I almost didn't catch it. "You don't know." Know what? Forget I said anything. But the whole table had already gone still, and stillness like that doesn't reset. My mother crossed the room in 4 steps, hooked her hand through my father's arm, and steered him toward the gift table like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just watched 26 years crack down the middle in front of 100 wedding guests and a 3-tier cake. I didn't forget. I have never once, in my whole life, been able to forget something just because someone asked me to. My name is Emma Whitfield. I'm 26 years old, and until that Saturday in April, I believed I knew exactly 2 things about where I came from: that I was adopted and that no one was ever supposed to ask about it twice. I want to explain what normal looked like, because normal is the thing that makes this hurt in the specific way it does. Robert and Linda Whitfield raised me in a split-level house in Millbrook, 40 minutes outside Sacramento, with a swing set my father built himself the summer I turned 4, and a mother who kept a photo album, an actual physical album, spine cracked from use, that started with a hospital picture of me at 2 days old. She used to pull it out on my birthday every year and narrate it like a bedtime story. "This was the day we got the call," she'd say. "This was the happiest day of our lives." The story never changed. Closed agency adoption, a birth mother in her early 20s, a college student in Sacramento who wanted better for me than she could give me at the time. No name, no records, no further questions, because, and this was the part that ended every conversation before it could become one, the birth mother had asked for privacy, and respecting that privacy was the last kind thing my parents could do for a woman who'd given them their daughter. I stopped asking when I was 12, not because I stopped wondering. I stopped because I noticed once that every time I brought it up, my mother's eyes did the same thing, went glassy, then wet, then she'd excuse herself to the kitchen for a few minutes and come back with a forced brightness that felt worse than the tears. I was 12. I didn't want to make my mother cry, so I built a small private room in my head where the questions lived, and I mostly kept the door shut. Here's what I told myself about the hair: recessive genes, a quirk. Grandma Whitfield had a photo somewhere of a great aunt with reddish hair, my mother said once, early on, before she stopped offering explanations at all. Genetics are strange. Redheads pop up in families that haven't seen red hair in generations. I read that on a genetics forum at 16, and it satisfied me completely because I wanted it to. Robert and Linda both have dark hair. Brown eyes, both of them. Deep and matching, the kind of coloring that shows up in every family photo going back to their own wedding. I have red hair and green eyes. And until that Saturday, that fact had never once needed a better explanation than a shrug and a story about a great aunt nobody had a picture of. Uncle David, my father's younger brother. I'd met maybe 4 times in my life. Christmas when I was 9, a funeral when I was 15. He lived in Seattle, and the story was that he and my father had drifted, the way brothers sometimes do, over something that happened before I was born. Something involving a falling out so old and so vague that asking about it felt like asking about the moon landing. Technically knowable, but so far outside the family's daily orbit that nobody bothered. David had red hair, green eyes. I remembered that from the funeral, actually. Remembered thinking, distantly, that we had the same color, and filing it away as one more coincidence in a life that apparently ran on them. There was one other thing, small enough that I'd never once connected it to anything. My mother kept every piece of my childhood paperwork in a fireproof lockbox in the hallway closet, the kind you'd use for a house deed or a passport. When I was 17 and needed my birth certificate for a driver's license appointment, she wouldn't let me get it myself. She disappeared into the closet, came back out with exactly the one document I needed already in hand, and put the box away before I'd even finished tying my shoes. I remember thinking at the time that she was just being efficient. 26 years old and sitting on my kitchen floor, I would come to understand that efficiency was never what that was. I did not think about any of it again until Marlene's hand closed around my wrist. I went home that night to my apartment in Roseville and sat on my kitchen floor. Not the couch, the floor, because the couch felt too far away from something I needed to be close to the ground for, and I pulled up every family photo I owned. 26 years of birthdays, 26 years of Christmas mornings in matching pajamas my mother insisted on until I was 14. Camping trips. First day of school pictures, kindergarten through senior year, lined up in a folder my mother had digitized herself. In every single one, I was the only redhead in the frame. name. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Adopted kids don't match their families. That's the whole premise of adoption. Of course I looked different. That was never the mystery. The mystery, the thing my chest wouldn't let go of, was why a room full of people who'd known my family for decades had gone silent at the sound of one name. Like the name itself was a live wire nobody wanted to touch. I called my mother the next morning. She picked up on the second ring, voice bright in a way that felt rehearsed. "Morning, sweetie. Wasn't the wedding gorgeous?" "Mom, what did Marlene mean last night? About Uncle David?" The pause was small. A half second, maybe less. But I'd spent 26 years learning the difference between my mother's normal pauses and this one had teeth in it. "Marlene had 4 glasses of champagne and doesn't know what she's talking about," my mother said. "You know how she gets." She said I look like him. "You have similar coloring. It happens." A little laugh, too quick. "I have to run, honey. Your father's calling me. Love you." She hung up before I could say it back. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. My stomach had gone tight and low, the specific tightness I recognized from every other moment in my life when I'd caught someone in a lie small enough to explain away and too precise to be nothing. I told myself, she's protecting Marlene from an awkward moment. That's all. Families do that. I did not believe myself even a little. 3 days later, I drove to Millbrook for Sunday dinner, same as I did most weeks, and I brought a printed photo with me. The one from David's mother's funeral, the one where he's standing off to the side in a gray suit, red hair catching the light from the church's side window. I put it on the table between the mashed potatoes and the green beans. "Can I ask you something about Uncle David?" My father, who almost never comments on family history, set his fork down with a precision that felt like it cost him something. "What about him? Why did you two stop talking?" "That's old business, Emma. Nothing that concerns you. It concerns me if he's the reason a room full of people went dead silent at Diane's wedding." My mother's hand found her water glass and gripped it hard enough that I watched her knuckles whiten. "Your father asked you not to bring this up." "I'm not bringing up your fight. I'm asking why I have his hair." Nobody answered. My father looked at his plate. My mother looked at my father. The silence went on long enough that I heard the refrigerator cycle on in the next room, a small mechanical hum filling a gap that neither of them would. "It's a coincidence," my mother finally said. "Genetics are strange," the exact phrase she'd used when I was 16, word for word. I noticed that, filed it, and said nothing else for the rest of dinner, because some instinct, old, animal, the kind that doesn't need language to know when it's being lied to, told me that pushing harder that night would only teach them to get better at the lie, and I wasn't ready to show my hand yet. I drove home with my knuckles pale on the steering wheel and a decision already forming that I hadn't consciously made. I was going to find out, whatever it cost. I ordered a DNA testing kit online that week, and when it arrived, I didn't register it under my own name. I used an email address I'd created that morning, one with no last name attached, and I mailed the sample from a post office in Citrus Heights, 2 towns from my apartment, on a Tuesday during my lunch break, the clerk barely glancing at the padded envelope before stamping it and dropping it in the outgoing bin. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't paranoia for its own sake. It was that some part of me already suspected the answer would matter to more people than just me, and I didn't want anyone, not my mother, not anyone, tracing the request back to me before I had proof solid enough that denial wouldn't work anymore. The wait was 6 weeks. I have never experienced 6 weeks like those 6 weeks. I checked the tracking number the way some people check a wound to see if it's healing, compulsively, uselessly, like watching it would change anything about what was underneath. Day 9, sample received at the lab. Day 14, processing. Then nothing, for almost a month, just the same static status sitting there every time I refreshed the page, as if the lab had swallowed my sample whole and forgotten it existed. I rehearsed conversations with my mother in the shower, in traffic, lying awake at 2 a.m. staring at the ceiling fan. None of the rehearsed versions ever felt safe enough to actually have. In one version, I screamed at her. In another, I said nothing at all, just set the results on the kitchen table between us and waited to see what she'd do with the silence. I never got further than the opening line in any of them before my chest tightened enough that I had to stop. At work, I do marketing analytics for a mid-size agi-tech company in Roseville, work that requires a kind of careful, patient pattern reading that I was apparently about to need in my personal life too. I caught myself staring at spreadsheets without reading them, running the same 3 unanswered questions on a loop until my manager, a woman named Priya, who'd known me for 4 years, asked if I was feeling all right. I told her I hadn't been sleeping. That much, at least, was true. Somewhere around week 5, I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I called a genetic counselor's office and asked, hypothetically, what it would mean if a DNA test came back showing an unexpected parent. I didn't give my name. I just needed to hear from someone who did this professionally that whatever I was about to learn was survivable. The woman who answered, kind and unhurried, told me that late discovery genetic surprises were far more common than most people assumed, and that reputable labs generally recommended confirming any unexpected result with a second, independently drawn sample before treating it as final. I didn't know yet that I'd need that advice, but I wrote the office number down anyway, on a sticky note pressed to the inside of my kitchen cabinet, like some part of me already suspected I'd be calling it back. The results came on a Tuesday in early June. I opened the email alone, sitting on my kitchen floor again, because apparently that was where my body had decided this particular kind of news belonged. Predicted relationship, father. Match, David Harris. Estimated shared DNA, 3,467 cm. I read it 4 times before the letters stopped rearranging themselves. My uncle, my biological father. The man my family had exiled to Seattle over a misunderstanding, nobody had ever, in 26 years, bothered to explain to me. I called the number I found for him, a Seattle area code, a name that matched an obituary notice for his mother that I'd found buried in old family emails before I could talk myself out of it. My hands were shaking badly enough that I dialed wrong twice. He picked up on the 4th ring. Hello? Is this David Harris? A pause. Not confusion. Recognition. Immediate and total. The kind of recognition that only comes from having waited for exactly this call for a very long time. Emma, he said, like he'd rehearsed the word in his head for 26 years and was still surprised to hear it land in his own voice. My knees went soft enough that I had to brace a hand against the kitchen cabinet. You know who I am. I've known since before you were born. Are you my father? The silence stretched longer than any silence in my life had ever stretched. I could hear him breathing on the other end, uneven, like he was deciding whether 26 years of practiced restraint was worth protecting anymore. Yes, one word. It cracked something open in my chest that had been holding perfectly still, without my permission, for as long as I could remember. He told me the rest in pieces over the next hour, his voice breaking every few sentences in a way that made me believe him more, not less. The kind of grief that's had decades to calcify and still isn't done cracking. At 23, he said, he'd fallen for a woman named Carolyn. She was engaged to his best friend at the time, in a relationship that was already coming apart at the seams before David ever entered the picture. He was careful to make sure I understood that part, like it mattered to him that I not think he'd broken up a happy marriage. She got pregnant before David could figure out what he was supposed to do about any of it. He was 23, scared, still living paycheck to paycheck. His older brother stepped in, my father, Robert. Robert and Linda told Carolyn that David was unstable, broke, not father material, not somebody a baby should have to depend on. They told David separately that Carolyn had already decided on adoption. Closed, out of state, gone, nothing left to fight for. Then, quietly, they offered to raise the baby themselves. To keep it in the family was the phrase David remembered 26 years later, word for word, like it had been carved into him. David was told he had no legal standing left to contest it. Carolyn was told I'd gone to strangers, hundreds of miles away, into a life she'd never be able to trace. Neither of them knew the truth. Robert and Linda had kept me the entire time, 4 miles from where David had grown up, in the same county, under the same sky, and built a 26-year story elaborate enough to survive Christmas dinners and funerals, and a family friend's wedding reception, right up until a woman with too much champagne in her forgot to keep the story straight for one single sentence. Every Thanksgiving I skipped, David said. Every reunion I was mysteriously too busy for. That wasn't shame, Emma. That was distance your parents engineered, and then let everyone believe was my choice. They said if I ever came near you, he told me, his voice finally breaking all the way through, they'd tell everyone I abandoned you, that I walked away and never looked back. So I stayed away. I told myself I was protecting you from a mess I'd caused. My hand was shaking hard enough that I nearly dropped the phone. Why didn't you fight harder? I was 23 and ashamed. A long breath, ragged on the other end. That's not an excuse. I know that. I've had 26 years to know that. By Thursday, I'd found Carolyn's married name through an old mutual acquaintance's public social media. Reed. Married to Michael, the same man she'd been engaged to when I was born, the relationship apparently having survived whatever had nearly broken it. 2 grown sons. A whole separate life that had no idea what it had quietly been built on top of. I called her Thursday night, hands cold, script long abandoned. She started crying before I finished my first full sentence. I was told you were gone, she said, voice cracking apart in real time. Adopted somewhere I'd never be able to find you. I mourned you for 26 years, Emma. I have a candle I light every year on your birthday. I didn't even know what to call what I was grieving. I sat with that for a long moment, the 2 of us breathing across a phone line that had just collapsed 26 years of distance into nothing. I need to see documentation, I finally said, because some part of me, the analytics part, the part that reads spreadsheets for a living, knew that feelings alone weren't going to be enough to make what came next. Hold up. Anything you still have, hospital records, anything with a date on it. I have the discharge papers, Carolyn said. I never threw them away. I don't know why I kept them. I think some part of me always knew I'd need them someday. I didn't call my parents on Friday. I drove straight to their house, and I brought David with me, flown in the night before, sitting quiet and nervous in my passenger seat the whole 40 minutes from the airport, his hands twisting together in his lap like a man rehearsing an apology he'd owed to 2 women for half his life. My mother opened the door, already smiling, the same smile she'd used my entire childhood to smooth over every question I was never supposed to finish asking. Then she saw who was standing behind me on the porch. The smile didn't fade slowly. It just stopped, all at once, like someone had cut the power to it. Emma, her voice had gone thin. What is this? You know what this is, I said. I have his DNA match. I have Carolyn's discharge papers from the hospital. I have 26 years of photo albums where I'm the only redhead in every single frame, and a story about a great aunt nobody's ever been able to show me a picture of. My father appeared behind her in the doorway, and for the first time in my life, I watched him look old. Not older, old, all at once. The way a building looks different the second you learn its foundation is cracked. Come inside, he said quietly. Please, let's not do this on the porch. We sat in the living room where I'd opened Christmas Christmas presents for 26 years. David across from Robert like two brothers meeting for the first time in a decade, which, I understood now, watching them, was almost exactly what this was. I want to understand something, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. Steady in the specific way that comes right before you fall apart, not after. Did you ever plan to tell me? At any point in 26 years? My mother's eyes were wet, but she didn't look away, and I gave her credit for that much. We told ourselves we would, when you turned 18, then when you graduated, then she stopped. There was never a right time, and every year it didn't happen. The not telling got heavier, until it felt impossible to ever put down. You didn't just not tell me, I said. You built a fake mother in Sacramento, a closed agency that never existed. You let a woman mourn me for 26 years for no reason, because the truth was inconvenient for the story you wanted. We loved you, my father said, and his voice cracked in a way I'd never once heard it crack in my life. Everything we did, we told ourselves it was because we loved you. That's not the same as it being true, David said quietly, the first thing he'd said since we'd walked in, and it landed harder for the silence that preceded it. I loved her too, Robert. You didn't get to decide that my love didn't count. Nobody had an answer for that. The room held it for a long, ringing moment, and I understood, watching my parents' faces, that this was the sound of 26 years of careful architecture finally, completely coming down. I didn't know what to do with any of it, legally, practically, emotionally, so the following week I sat across from Patricia Alvarez, a family law attorney with 19 years of experience specializing in adoption fraud and parentage disputes, in an office 3 floors above a coffee shop in downtown Sacramento. What you're describing, she said, reading through the DNA report and the photocopied hospital discharge papers Carolyn had overnighted to me, isn't a private family matter you have to just absorb. Depending on exactly how the paperwork was handled at the time, this could constitute fraudulent adoption practices, falsification of parentage records, or in the worst case, actual identity fraud if a birth certificate was altered without legal proceeding. They never filed for adoption, I said. There's no paperwork. There never was an agency. Patricia looked up sharply. Then whose name is on your birth certificate? I hadn't thought to check. That night I did. Robert Whitfield, Linda Whitfield, listed as my biological parents on a state-issued document with no adoption ever having occurred at all. That's not a gray area, Patricia said when I brought the copy back to her office 2 days later. That's a falsified vital record. Depending on how it was filed, through a cooperative doctor, a home birth claim, an out-of-state loophole, this is potentially a felony. I'd want to bring in a forensic document examiner before we go further, someone who can establish exactly how and when that certificate was created. Everything came apart at once, the way Patricia had warned me it might. Carolyn, once she understood the certificate existed, wanted to file a police report immediately. She'd mourned a fictional adoption for 26 years, and wanted the record corrected regardless of what it cost my parents. David, still raw and guilty in ways I didn't fully understand yet, wanted to give Robert a chance to fix it privately first. My mother called me 11 times in one afternoon, alternating between sobbing apologies and controlled, lawyer-adjacent language that told me Robert had already spoken to someone of his own. I had, by Patricia's estimate, a narrow window, before Carolyn filed independently, before my parents' own attorney could shape the narrative first, to decide how I wanted this handled, and I had less than 48 hours to decide it. My hands wouldn't stop shaking that whole Wednesday. I couldn't hold a coffee cup steady long enough to drink from it. I sat at my desk at work and stared at a dashboard of quarterly engagement metrics that meant nothing to me, running calculations in my head that had nothing to do with the spreadsheet. How many people would this touch? How much of my mother's life would collapse? Whether David's fragile, rebuilding relationship with me could survive a courtroom? I called Patricia at 6 p.m. I need to know what my options actually are. All of them. Tonight. You have 3, realistically, she said. 1, you do nothing, and this stays a family wound that never gets formally addressed. 2, Carolyn files, and you become a witness in a case you don't control the pace of. 3, you initiate a correction of your own vital records, with documentation from a licensed genetic counselor and the DNA lab, and you let that process, not anger, not a courtroom drama, do the work of establishing what's true. And if my parents fight it, then it becomes adversarial. But Emma, the DNA evidence, the photocopied discharge papers, the certificate discrepancy, that's not a fight they can win. It's a fight they can only drag out. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long time after we hung up, watching the sun go down through my kitchen window, and I made the decision alone, the way I'd made every real decision in this whole ordeal alone, sitting on that same floor. I chose option 3. The correction process took 11 weeks. I want to be honest that it wasn't cinematic. There was no single dramatic reveal, no gavel coming down. It was a genetic counselor named Dr. Aaron Feld reviewing the DNA lab's chain of custody documentation and issuing a formal report confirming parentage to a legal standard. It was a forensic document examiner retained by Patricia, confirming that my birth certificate had been filed through a small private clinic that had since closed, using a doctor who, it turned out this detail arriving almost as an afterthought, had already lost his license 8 years earlier for a separate, unrelated falsification case. It was Patricia filing a formal petition to correct my vital records, listing David Harris and Carolyn Reed as biological parents, supported by lab documentation strong enough that my parents' attorney, after reviewing it, advised them not to contest it. Robert and Linda did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that too, because I know some part of what makes these stories satisfying is a clean villain getting a clean punishment, and that's not quite what happened here. The statute of limitations on the original filing had long since passed for most of what they'd done. What happened instead was slower and, in its own way, more thorough. The certificate was corrected. The truth became the official record. My mother's siblings, Marlene included, learned the full story, not the wine-loosened fragment of it, and several of them stopped speaking to my parents entirely, not out of cruelty, but because they couldn't reconcile 26 years of holiday dinners with the woman who'd let Carolyn believe her daughter was gone. My father, standing at his church, where he'd been a deacon for over a decade, quietly ended when the story worked its way through the congregation the way these things do, not because anyone announced it, but because people stopped meeting his eyes, and eventually he stopped showing up. Carolyn and I see each other most weekends now. She still has the candle. She lit it this year with me standing next to her for the first time in 26 years, and neither of us said anything for a long time afterward. David and I are still building something neither of us has a word for yet. Not quite father-daughter, not yet, maybe not ever entirely. 26 years is a long time to make up, and he knows that better than anyone, but he calls every Sunday now, and I answer every time. It's been almost a year. My mother has written me 4 letters. I've read all 4. I've answered none of them, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely don't yet know what I'd say that wouldn't just be a kinder version of the same silence she gave me for 26 years, and I'm not willing to hand her that yet. I saw a therapist for the first time in my life this spring, Dr. Renee Castillo, who specializes in late discovery adoptees, a category of person I didn't know existed until I became one. She told me something in our second session that I've turned over in my head more times than I can count, that the hardest part of a story like mine isn't usually the lie itself. It's realizing how much of your own memory you have to re-narrate once you know the lie was there. Every birthday, every Christmas morning in matching pajamas, all of it real, and all of it built on something false, both at the same time, and learning to hold both of those truths without one canceling the other out. I still have red hair. I used to explain it away with a story about a great aunt nobody could produce a photograph of. Now, when someone asks, I just tell them the truth. I got it from my father.